Yeah, cool. So yeah, I'm going to talk about us using mobile EEG and augmented reality to look at cognitive effects in the real world. So what we're interested in is how we make sense of what we see in the real world. So as I'm sure you guys are aware, the real world is very complex. It's made up of a number of different features, different colors, textures, spatial frequencies, lots of different objects. But to be able to behave appropriately in the real world, we need to be able to recognize objects quickly, such as which one of our bikes is amongst the group of parked bikes over there, or recognizing cars coming down the road so we can make safe crossing decisions. And this is something that we can typically do quickly and easily. But what we're interested in is what are the brain mechanisms behind this process of recognizing objects, and what is the impact of context on this process. So we know from previous studies that the environment in which objects are located can impact on our ability to recognize them. And one thought as to how this happens is, say you're walking around an environment like this one, you start to make predictions about what kind of objects could appear in the environment. So you might predict to see trees or flowers or a fox like this one. And when these predictions are correct, they can help facilitate object recognition. But when these predictions are violated, such as seeing a fox indoors, it slows down our ability to recognize these objects, which has been shown through various behavioral neuroimaging studies, showing slower response times to objects that are inconsistent with the environment compared to objects that are consistent with the environment. And in terms of EEG event-related potential studies, they typically show larger amplitudes of the N300 and N400 event-related potentials to inconsistent objects, suggesting inconsistent objects take a bit more effort to process than consistent objects. However, typically when you do these studies, you present participants with pictures of objects embedded in pictures of scenes, whilst the participant is in one of these rooms like this, or in an MRI. So they're typically removed from a natural context. So we don't have a good idea of how cognitive effects, such as consistency effects, really develop when participants are in the real world. And we don't really have the data to be able to say whether the tasks that we use in the labs translate to our natural behavior in the real world. And in fact, certain studies looking to bridge the gap between the real world and the lab suggest the brain responds differently to natural context as it does to controlled lab-based experiments. For example, the selectivity of orientation cells in V1 and place cells in the hippocampus tend to differ between real and controlled settings. And neuroimaging effects, such as the adaptation effect, when you look at shapes of 2D objects, is present when you're looking at 2D pictures, but disappears when you're looking at the real 3D objects. So it seems that if we want to get a good idea of how the brain functions in the real world, we really want to be moving participants into the real world. So this is what we wanted to do here. We want to look at the impact of context on object recognition when participants are wandering around the real world performing natural behaviors. So to be able to do that, we need to record neural activity in real environments while participants are performing somewhat natural behaviors. So for that, we use mobile EEG. But we still wanted to be able to control what people see in the world, the variety of the objects participants see, and when participants see them, so we use augmented reality for that. So now I'll just take you through our augmented reality and mobile EEG setups, starting with the augmented reality. So for this, we use the HoloLens 2, which allows us to present 2D and 3D virtual objects in the real world, such as this chameleon here, and these can even be animated. And then as this chameleon cycles around me, the HoloLens will keep track of my eye movements using 30 Hz eye tracking, and it will also keep track of my head position and orientation using an accelerometer and a gyroscope. And then the other thing that the HoloLens can do is it can take scans of the real world, a visual demonstration of which you'll see here in a second. So those blue triangles is a demonstration of the HoloLens taking a scan of the real world. And it doesn't just scan like the rooms around me, it also scans surfaces, so it will keep track of the position of the table and the chairs here. And as I walk through the real world, the HoloLens is continuously taking a scan, and it will put these scans together into a 3D map of the real world, an example of which you can see here, which may not seem the most coherent, but you can probably make out a stairwell here, as well as some windows on a wall, and then an outdoor wall and some windows here. And these 3D maps are useful because I can use them to place virtual objects exactly where I want them to appear in the real world. And the way that I do this is I take this 3D map and import it into 3D modeling software, such as Experimenter, which I'll do here. And then this is the same model that you saw on the previous slide, but from a top-down view. And this area here is the seminar room, which you saw the chameleon in a couple of slides ago. And then this rectangle here, within the room, is the table that you saw the chameleon cycling on. And if I wanted to place a virtual object onto that table in the real world, all I have to do is import or create a model object, such as this loudspeaker object here, put it in position in the virtual map. And then all I have to do is export this as an application to the HoloLens, run the application on the HoloLens, and then it will present that loudspeaker object on the table in the real world. So it would appear where you saw the chameleon a couple of slides ago. And as I mentioned, I'm using Experimenter software. This is software which allows you to create virtual and augmented reality psychology experiments using a point-and-click interface. There's no coding required. And it's integrated with things like EEG, other biosensors, and eye tracking. So it's a really great tool if people want to get into virtual and augmented reality. But coming back to our work, that's our augmented reality setup. So now I'll just take you through our mobile EEG setup. So for this, we use the Brain Products Live Amp 64-channel system, which looks like this. And it's pretty much similar to your lab-based EEG setups. And the quality is very similar when participants are sitting down in front of a computer. It has active shielding to help reduce any motion artifacts. And also, in comparison to other mobile EEG systems, it has flatter electrodes, which reduce any discomfort that might be caused by placing a head-mounted device on top of the electrodes. And the other nice thing about it is it has wireless amplifiers, which allow for onboard recording, meaning participants only need to take with them the amplifiers. They don't need an additional recording laptop. So it's really lightweight and easy to move around with. So that's our mobile EEG and augmented reality setups. So now I'll just take you through the tasks that we used to examine cognitive effects in the real world. So for this, participants had to find these blue arrows, which you can't see. There we go. And all they had to do was walk up to them. And when they got close enough to them, they turned green, which indicated to the participant that they needed to press a button on a button box that they were carrying with them. And when they pressed the button, it caused an object to appear. And at the same time, it sends a trigger to the EEG, so we know when to epoch the data for the data analysis. So when they press the button, an object appears for about 3 seconds. And then it disappears, and participants are presented with a question asking them how expected the object was on a scale from 1 to 5, or in other words, how consistent they thought the object was with the environment. So I'll just show you an example trial that participant performed. All right, and then for this, participants saw 80 objects for the experiment in total, 40 of which were outdoors and 40 of which were indoors. And half the objects in the experiment were consistent with the environment, and half the objects were inconsistent with the environment. So that's the task that the participants performed. And we collected data from 34 participants. And I'll just take you through how we pre-processed and analyzed some of that data. So for the pre-processing, we followed the B-Mobile pipeline developed by Marius Klug in Klaus Grammann's lab. Now, this group have done a lot of mobile EEG stuff combined with virtual reality and body motion tracking. And they developed a fully automated pre-processing pipeline for mobile EEG. And what we do is we import the raw EEG data into EEG Lab, downsample the data to 250 Hertz, and then remove line noise using the Zap line toolbox. We remove and interpolate bad channels using standard EEG Lab functions. Bandpass filter the data. We use cutoffs at 1 and 20 Hertz. And then we epoch the data, at which point it looks like this here. And you can see there's still a couple of blink artifacts and a couple of other things. And so we baseline correct the data and then remove those additional artifacts using ICA, at which point it comes out looking like this, and all the blinks and other artifacts are typically removed. So you can see it kind of follows a very similar pipeline to what you would use for lab-based experiments. And now I'll just show you data from one participant. And you can see that in this average GRP, we get a nice visually evoked response. So you get a nice P1 and N170 here. And this appears across most of the trials in the experiment. So it seems that we can use this augmented reality setup to produce reliable visually evoked responses in our participants, which we then can go on to analyze. So I'll just show you the analysis that we've done so far for this. So just as a reminder of what's been found before in terms of consistency effects, Typically, people find a larger amplitude of the N300 and N400 ERPs to objects that are inconsistent with the environment compared to objects that are consistent with the environment. So the first thing that we wanted to see was whether we could replicate this finding when objects are embedded in the real world. And then the other thing is that as participants are rating consistency on a 5-point scale, we can get a little bit more detail as to what the relationship is between EEG amplitude and consistency. For example, is it a linear or U-shaped relationship? And certainly some memory studies looking at the impact of context on the memorability of objects has shown a U-shaped relationship between memory and consistency. So it'd be interesting to see whether we find that in the EEG data. But first, looking at the ERP effects. So we first looked across central channels, as that's where consistency effects have been found before. And we find no significant effect in the N300 or N400 time windows across central channels. But what you might be able to make out from this difference topography is there appears to be some kind of difference going on in posterior electrodes early on. And so looking at the ERP effects across posterior electrodes, we do get a significant effect in the N300 time window, but not the N400 time window. And then, as I mentioned, participants are rating consistency on a 5-point scale, so we can get a little bit more detail as to what the relationship is between EEG amplitude and consistency. So we ran some linear mixed models in the N300 and N400 time windows for central and posterior electrodes. And the only significant finding we get is a linear relationship between consistency and amplitude in the N300 time window across posterior electrodes. So that fits nicely with our ERP results. And it seems that even when objects are placed in real-world environments, there is some kind of consistency effect. But there are some slight differences between consistency effects that we see in the real world. For example, it seems to be restricted to the earlier N300 time window, whilst lab-based findings would also find a difference in N400 time windows. So this is kind of everything that we've done so far. So I'll just kind of summarize. So it seems we can use augmented reality and mobile EEG to obtain reliable visually evoked responses, and we can use this to replicate certain lab-based findings in the real world. But there are some differences between these findings in the real world compared to the lab-based. For example, the effects seem to be restricted to the earlier time window rather than the later N400 time window as found for lab-based effects. So perhaps the processing or effects are occurring earlier in the brain in the real world. So that's everything we've done so far. So I'll just thank my PI and the other members of the lab, our collaborator Ben at Silico Labs, and our summer students who helped, Shirley and Natasha, who helped collect some data. And any questions?